an architecture media podcast supported by the Australian Institute of Architects, produced on Boonwurrung country.
Welcome to Design Speaks Weekly, a podcast that explores the biggest stories in Australian architecture and design. I'm your host, Georgia Burks, and today, Lucia Amies, editor of ArchitectureAu, speaks with Belqis Youssofzay, director of architecture practice Youssofzay Hart, about the opportunities and limitations of the emerging architect label. But first, here's the latest news headlines from ArchitectureAu.
In the news this week, the architects of two Queensland stadium projects set to be delivered ahead of the Brisbane 2032 Olympics have been announced. Cox Architecture and 3XN will serve as principal architects of a new 12,000-seat arena on the Gold Coast, while Architectus will lead an upgrade of the Barlow Park Stadium in Cairns. And in Melbourne, a 10-year vision for the restoration and renewal of St Patrick's Cathedral has been unveiled. The $190 million plan reimagines the precinct as a place not only for worship, but for culture and connection, with new architecture by Candelepis Associates. Those are the headlines for this week. For the full stories and more news, visit architectureau.com. I'm Adair Winder. It's Tuesday, March 24.
Youssofzay Hart is an award-winning architectural and interior design practice based in Sydney. The studio is well acquainted with the emerging architecture label and all that comes with it. Led by directors Belqis Youssofzay and David Hart, the practice works with leading Australian and international arts institutions, including the Powerhouse Museum, M+ in Hong Kong, and the University of Sydney, to design galleries, exhibitions, installations, and interiors. In this episode, Lucia Amies, editor of ArchitectureAu, speaks with Belqis about whether the emerging architect label is a double-edged sword. Hi, Bel. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So look, I just wanted to start off and say readers of ours have been really enjoying our ArchitectureAu Asks series, where we ask a range of industry leaders to respond to a provocation on a current topic. Our latest question asks whether the emerging architect label diminishes the influence, the agency, and perceived capability of early career architects, and by extension that of the profession more broadly. The topic has had a lot of interest, so we thought we'd flesh it out further for Design Speaks Weekly listeners. The term emerging architect is deeply embedded within the profession and carries with it real consequences, both positive and negative. How do you think we should grapple with a label that offers valuable recognition and support to early career practitioners while simultaneously risking the undermining of their skill, their expertise, and their ambition? Do you think it's something that we need to overcome or maybe something to embrace?
I think it's a good question. For us, as a practice, we have been grappling with it for nearly 9 years now. And I think one of the things I was thinking about was the title itself, emerging practice. Maybe a decade or so ago, that title didn't exist. If there was a new practice on the scene, they were referred to as a new practice or an exciting new practice. But I guess the titling of the emerging practice, for us at least, coincided with New South Wales government's pre-qualification scheme that was inviting participation from new practices to participate on larger scale projects. So that's when we started referring to ourselves as the emerging practice, because it kind of carried, I guess, for us, a positioning within the practice, where we could say we're an emerging practice, so we can apply to be part of this competition or, a design excellence competition. But I guess in the subsequent years, so this is, we're talking 2017, where we won a competition for the missing middle. And I think that's around that time that the emerging practice pre-qualification scheme came to our attention. I'm sure it probably existed a couple of years before that, but that's when we as a practice participated. I think subsequently, we embraced that title because I think there's two things to it. One was that it was opening up a set of opportunities for us that didn't exist before. So the pre-qualification scheme meant that we were getting invited by architecture teams, to participate, whether it was on competitions or whether it was on a project. It was almost like a policy thing. It became a prerequisite. But philosophically, I think we embraced it more because I think our generation or my generation, I think we are kind of at a cusp of change professionally. And I think that is something that is not talked about as often. And I think this emerging practice label is helping us kind of define that. What do I mean by we're on the cusp? I think we're a generation that's contending with climate crisis. We're a generation that's contending with population growth and, as a consequence, cultural and demographic shifts. And importantly, we're also contending and reconciling with our connecting with country principles that I would say a decade or so ago didn't have the prominence that it has in design thinking now. So I think we philosophically embraced that emerging practice label because it meant that we were kind of building a bridge between what was old practice and what the possibilities could be for new practice.
Yep.
But I guess then there's the added layer of it, which is the pragmatics of it. What does that mean for us practically? And within that there's opportunities and there are challenges that we have to contend with. But whether we embrace that label or need to change it, I think philosophically, yes, embrace it by all means, because it signals an attitude change, it signals a change to approach. But I think we really do need to challenge and question how that's implemented.
Yeah, for sure. It seems to me that the Emerging Architect label has opened quite a few avenues of work for your practice, Youssofzay Hart. Looking at your folio, you've worked on many public-facing art institutions in Australia and also some abroad, and as well those competitions that you were talking about. I wonder if that Emerging Architect label is driving not just those opportunities to work on public projects, but also the kind of approach that you might bring to those projects. As the emerging architect on the project, I wonder if the team are looking at you for those creative, fresh, emerging ideas. Do you find that?
I think so. Look, to an extent, yes, I think there is that appetite and that reception for new ideas. I think also, again, talking about my generation, I think we're contending with a lot of things that almost pushes us to be advocates, right? We have to be really clear about our philosophical, ideological positioning on a few of those things. And that brings design clarity, right? That brings that filters through your design thinking. But I think our ideas do get embraced to an extent, but I think we still, I feel personally, this is my own experience, that I think there still needs to be some structural shifts to open that up. Sometimes even getting an idea across is a challenge, regardless of whether you're an emerging practice or an established one, but more so as an emerging practice, because it kind of forms an identity around you in terms of your capability and your contribution. I do think there's opportunity for creative thinking. To be honest with you, I think creative thinking exists across the whole spectrum of practice. I think where the change needs to happen is how that creative thinking is recalibrated to address all those things I noted before, the challenges of our time.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you. I'm thinking just around the limitations that you've talked about, and particularly how the emerging label is applied and then perceived by the industry. Let's say you're working in these kind of bigger collaborative teams or on bigger projects and you're the emerging architect. Do you think that label has a way of shifting teammates' perceptions about your role and also maybe your capability? Is sometimes for better, but also sometimes for worse?
Yeah, and I think, look, from our own experience, it has been both. I think there have been moments where our ideas or untested ideas are brought forward through these collaborations. And I think that's the role of the emerging architect. We bring these untested ideas for consideration. But I think a lot of the times the perception, to be perfectly frank with you, a lot of practices that are considered emerging, they come with this wealth of knowledge and expertise. A lot of us set up our practices. I started my own practice almost a decade after having been in the profession and actually honing my expertise in a particular typology, which is, public facing cultural institutions. But what happens is the diminishment of that expertise. So once you become an emerging practice, it's never seen through the lens of expertise. It's seen through the lens of ideas. And I think we need to kind of reconcile the two. as well. I think if we're going to talk about expertise, or if we're talking about ideas, so it shouldn't just be that, the emerging practice is tasked with, coming up with new novel ideas and testing the status quo, but more so about also what is their expertise that they don't have the resources to implement because they're a small practice. And I think there's this tension between, an emerging practice is seen as small and under resourced, and as a consequence, that expertise is diminished, but that's not the case. And you would find that there are practices that have been, doing a particular type of work for 20 years, and I think they're still referred to as emerging practice. And I think that recalibration needs to happen in at that space as well.
Yeah, for sure. I imagine there's a difficulty there in breaking through the emerging architect label to explain to people, that, yeah, right now I might be running a 2-person practice and maybe only $2 million projects, but 2 years ago I was running $20 million projects.
That's right.
My next question is around how that emerging architect label is seen by clients and more broadly by the public. I mean, your practice works with a lot of residential clients, as many early career architects do, potentially because there's less commercial risk and residential clients are maybe more trusting. But sometimes those clients or prospective clients can see emerging practitioners as cheaper due to their youth or inexperience. And that can perpetuate a system in which architects undercut each other's fees to compete for work. I'm wondering, in these circumstances, how do you advocate your practice's value and how do you hold your ground?
Look, I think that's a really great question. I think sometimes the challenge, like, if a perception around you exists because you look a certain way, or you appear young and inexperienced, I think it's really hard to change any of that. And I think, frankly, I don't think there's anything you can say or do to change that perception, other than the fact that especially like with the small scale projects, I think that's where the challenge lies. I think for us, it has been a huge challenge to kind of prove ourselves. And I think the only way to prove it is to just build one project after another. And there's like this growing portfolio. I think for us, where the challenge lies is being in that dynamic of the emerging practice as part of a larger team. It's not so much with the resi clients or the small scale projects. It's often within the structure of a much bigger team. And I think the perception of the client within that. So, people want to identify, so what is it that you do on this project? And then you have to identify, I'm the emerging practice component of this winning competition. Like, I think it's just those labels created to justify, like, your position within a hierarchy. And I think as a profession, we need to kind of overcome that kind of label making that makes a hierarchy. I think even within the profession, people would say, so what is it that you're doing on this project? And you have to identify whether you're the established practice, or you're the project architect, or you're the emerging practice, and I think we need to start thinking about that as how are we within that team, that we are actually a team of architects, a team of practitioners doing this together and contributing to different facets. But in answer to your question, this was a long convoluted way to answer your question, but how do you do it? I think with great challenge. I think a lot of my peers would say the same thing. I think, it's a competitive industry, even to make your mark, so to say, which I think in itself is a problematic word. Why are we mark making? But I think even to really set your agenda clearly within the profession and within a broader market for the client, whether it's a large project or a small project, I think it's a tricky one. And I think we need to come together, I think, professionally, and this idea that I think we need to come as a cohort of colleagues that need to discuss this more openly, in terms of, well, how do we do this? How do we stop, undercutting our fees? How do we, I mean, it's a very idealistic answer, but how do we work in more collegiate ways? How do we work towards a singular focus? How do we support each other within the profession? I think that needs to exist. And I think that we need to talk more about it, whether it's in this forum or I think it's within a forum where if a few of us emerging practices or otherwise are catching up and discussing these things openly. And the ethics around it, that's the other big thing I think we don't talk about enough in our profession, but the ethical framework that guides our profession. I don't think there's a policy in place, not, I guess, in a way that gets implemented that stops one person taking the job of someone else. So I think those things need to be considered at a policy level.
Yeah, that's a really good insight. I mean, on that point of ethics in the profession, I do think it comes back to how architects, and not just emerging architects, but all architects, are portrayed by our industry and how they're perceived by the broader public. Often we hear of emerging artists, emerging writers, and emerging architects, but we don't often really hear of emerging doctors, emerging lawyers, or even emerging engineers. And to me, I think that's a problem in the sense that architects are positioned as creatives rather than as professionals, and that our ties bear more closely with art, than with an accredited training. And as you say, I think there's some work to do there. I wonder if you had any thoughts to add to that?
I think you make a very good point. I think, it is true. I've noticed it, there's always emerging writer, emerging artist, emerging architect, but never emerging doctor. And I think part of it has to do with our perception of creative labor. And I think I think we need to advocate better for that. This idea that even, I mean, I'll talk only to the emerging architect label because, I'm not a writer or an artist, but I think advocating for that, for your position as a fully fledged kind of professional at the very outset, even, back to your earlier question of how do we navigate that with a client. And I think part of it has to do with how do we position ourselves, like, this idea of advocating for our labor. And I think that has been undermined for the longest time, not just externally, not just by clients, but within the profession as well. The cost of the creative labor, where we need to bring a level of importance, and it's essential to what we do. And I think a lot of the time where, this competitive undercutting that you referred to before, that happens, I think part of it is that, the client's perception is architect's role as kind of a decoration, or someone who does the beautiful, the beautiful things, which we do. But I think there's a lot of complexity behind all of that. And I think we don't talk about it. Like, I think part of it is, like, sometimes when you do an awards thing, it's the glossy images that get published, right? But never the drawings that have all the complexities inherent. And, there are things around that I think that we can, as a profession, do that, advocate not just for ourselves but for each other. This idea that it might be a simple outcome and it looks great in a photograph, but behind that complexity is,
Years of process, isn't it?
ease of process, ease of expertise, ease of testing, even for the smallest, like, even if it's a drawing of a table, like if a photograph gets published of a table, behind it is like lots of drawings, lots of prototyping, lots of testing. How do we bring that into the conversation? Same with the client. You can't just give them a render when you're doing a concept. You have to show them the thinking and the drawings and everything that goes with that final image. So I think, back to that question, I think it comes to advocating for our creative labor as being essential and important. And it's not just creative labor in kind of getting a beautiful outcome, but creative labor and huge complex problem solving.
I love that answer. And it's a great note to end on. It's very inspiring. I think we should all get out there and advocate in everything we do. So yeah, thanks for those words. And just to end our episode, I have a final question that we've been asking our guests, and that is, what have you changed your mind about?
Look, I think right now, with, I guess, everything going on in the world, I'm just kind of the atmosphere in which you and I are having this podcast. It kind of feels almost like the world around is burning down, and I think for me, it's we need to, as individuals, not as an architect. I'm not talking as an architect here. I'm talking as a person, as a citizen. I think we need to advocate and protest more with things that we're not okay with, things we're not happy about. And I think I've changed my mind about this idea that things are beyond our control. I think, change begins small. And I think we need to remember that.
Thanks so much, Bel. Really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode, which is supported by the Australian Institute of Architects. If you're enjoying this podcast, be sure to subscribe, share, or leave a rating. I'm Georgia Burks, and this has been Design Speaks Weekly. Design Speaks Weekly is produced on Boonwurrung country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture.